couple of years ago, I took a long look at all the material Tucker Carlson was putting out in a single week while he was working at Fox News. Aside from his daily show on the Fox News cable channel, he also had several programs for the Fox Nation streaming service. As I said at the time, it was a rough week. Since making that video, Tucker Carlson has been fired from Fox News and now has a podcast that regularly uploads long-form interviews to YouTube. With only 3 videos or so going up a week, I thought instead of 1 week, it might be better to spend a whole month watching everything Tucker Carlson put out. Was it as rough as last time? Watch on to find out. Tucker's interview with his brother Buckley was the first podcast I watched, and I felt every minute of its runtime. Apparently, Buckley is achieving some kind of notoriety on social media, but this is my first time ever hearing from him. The conversation between Buckley and Tucker is not terribly interesting, and aside from giving us some insight into Tucker as a person, I'm not sure why we should care what his brother has to say about anything. Nonetheless, we did get a few insights into how Tucker works his magic. In particular, how he spins narratives out of nothing. For instance, here's a moment where a well-known rhyme has supposedly had its meaning inverted.
Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. It's actually been inverted, where we've endorsed sticks and stones.
Since when did we ever live our lives based on rhymes we tell children to help them get over being called mean names? It's like being surprised that the phrase, eat an apple a day keeps the doctor away, isn't currently being used as healthcare advice. It's not a bad rule of thumb, because apples are generally pretty good for you. But as an adult, you should be operating at a more sophisticated level. And all this fretting over the fact that we no longer see the world as children is in itself quite infantilizing. And there's also this weird bit at the end where he talks about the whole sticks and stones rhyme being inverted in a non-Western way that is very weird.
So sticks and stones are fine, but words are the threat. Like,
Yes.
What is that?
It's terrifying, actually.
It's not a Western orientation.
No, it's not.
They don't elaborate on this, and it was the only part I was at all curious about. It would have been truly something to see them try to blame China or some other non-Western country for how a children's rhyme no longer applies. And then 2 minutes later, Tucker concedes that words might be dangerous after all.
But I do think they're right to worry about words.
Yes.
Actually, words do change the world. The New Testament changed the world.
What I think this really highlights is how inane some of these conversations are, often dressed up as thoughtful or weighty conversations, when a lot of the time you just get stuff like this.
If you're a cigarette smoker, you're literally the dirtiest pariah in America.
And we get this, quite honestly, embarrassing story about how Buckley is a total badass because he refused to keep his dog on a leash.
You had 1 million dogs as always, and you never leashed them because you're a free man, and this is America.
We get the impression from Tucker that his brother is this rugged individual playing by his own rules, when to me he just sounded like a rich guy who was entitled to behave however he sees fit. At one point in the interview, he talks about never wearing a mask during the early months of COVID, and it's meant to make him look like a tough guy who just stands up to authority, the sort of thing you can do when your job doesn't depend on meeting basic safety requirements. I'm sure some of this is him trying to be funny, but it's the kind of humor that's paired with a smugness that's more worthy of a groan than a laugh. The text in the thumbnail talks about how they're living in North Korea, but when his brother offers examples, it's all incredibly silly. The big difference between living in the US and North Korea, regardless of your politics, is you can't go on a podcast in North Korea and start complaining about how bad it is to live there. Not only that, but the examples of masks, vaccinations, and the 2020 election conspiracies were widely spread on the right, and it made several people incredibly wealthy. To act like they're in some kind of totalitarian nightmare is incredibly silly and shows a completely skewed view of the world. Tucker and his brother grew up in wealth and privilege, and as best as I can tell, they have always had access to that kind of life. Although this interview is probably one of the least interesting ones I watched this month, it is a fun place to start because I think it gives us a proper grounding of who Tucker Carlson is and the kind of world he comes from. The next video has the most alarming title of the bunch. Breaking news, Russia will nuke Germany and the UK if Ukraine war continues, warns top Putin advisor. Sounds like pretty scary stuff. And it rang some alarm bells in the audience because it got a ton of views. This video is split into 2 parts. The first is a lengthy monologue from Tucker Carlson, and the second half an interview with Sergei Karaganov, a Russian political scientist who is making the claim that Russia might nuke Europe. Tucker Carlson has a long history of doing PR for Vladimir Putin, and that's on in full display in this video as he recounts the history of the invasion of Ukraine with unlimited charity for Putin's side and justifying any and all actions that he's taken. He spread some obvious untruths, such as no one is paying attention to how many Ukrainians have died.
How many Ukrainians have been killed in this war paid for by the West? Paid for by NATO and Joe Biden? No one knows.
Going back to when this video was first uploaded on January 14th, just 2 days prior, the UN Human Rights Mission monitoring Ukraine published a report about how many people in Ukraine have been killed. Various other institutions have also been tracking the number of deaths and other statistics related to this invasion. The number of Ukrainians who have died so far is actually something that's been closely monitored. And while it's always difficult to figure out exact numbers when there's a war going on, people are certainly paying attention, and it's not nearly the mystery that Tucker Carlson pretends it is. Later on, he misleads people in a way that's probably more clear to Canadians who are watching.
Chrystia Freeland is somehow working for unelected President Zelensky in Ukraine, who himself is not really that Ukrainian. Grew up speaking Russian. He's a citizen of the world like she is. Like they all are.
He'd eventually clarify that Chrystia Freeland has Ukrainian ancestors.
Chrystia Freeland had ancestors from Ukraine.
The ancestor he means is Freeland's mother. And I guess that's technically an ancestor, but it's hardly the distant connection to the country that he's trying to pretend it is. Also, he identifies her as a journalist before being placed in Justin Trudeau's cabinet. This is completely skipping how she was elected to Parliament in 2013. But the point of discrediting her is really just a pretext for this clip.
The new Ukrainian government, the new Ukrainian leadership, everyone who I know in that group has been touched somehow by Open Society and by Georgia, like literally. Either people personally got a scholarship or someone, their wife got a scholarship.
Everyone running the country is actually employed by this Hungarian billionaire who's got nothing to do with the country. Oh.
Getting a scholarship from the Open Society's foundation in the 1990s is translated to working for George Soros in 2015, which is when this interview was held. It's a gross exaggeration and indicative of how Carlson twists facts to build a narrative. Also, it feeds into an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, but I'll have a little more to talk about that later. Instead, I want to focus on where Tucker takes it in this video.
We can judge the tree by its fruit. And the current state of Ukraine was clearly the point all along. Destroy the country, depopulate it.
There is no analysis here. To use his tree analogy, if you found a seedling, came back decades later and found a tree had been chopped down, is it fair to assume that the person who planted the tree is responsible? Ukraine is not some kind of closed system. It is influenced by the people within it and actors outside of it. This is one of the big problems with how Tucker Carlson constructs his narratives. The current state of Ukraine is now placed at the feet of George Soros because 30 years prior, he awarded out some scholarships. There is no connective tissue here, no causality being established. If you're trying to make that point, this is what you would actually provide. Highlight who, if anyone, in Ukraine's government was working for Soros at any time. Then you would take those individuals and describe what they did that brought Ukraine towards its state in the present day. Instead, we're getting a clip of an interview and then just sort of gesturing to the current state, and I guess this is meant to be enough. It's really bad propaganda. This grand conspiracy, which he can't explain but is apparently evident when you look at the present-day state of Ukraine, also features the most unwise thing that the American government has done in Carlson's lifetime.
And there's a particularly sad line at the end of the clip you just saw from Lindsey Graham where he said, if just we can make our sanctions tough enough. We just need tough sanctions. And that will bring Russia to its knees. Well, we did that, actually. But who got brought to his knees? Was it Russia? No, it was not. It was us.
Sanctioning Russia is apparently the cause of all of America's economic hardships, not the ridiculous tariffs of Donald Trump or the threats to neighbors like Greenland, Canada, and Mexico. No, it was sanctioning Russia. Of course, the US has issued sanctions throughout its history, and putting aside the efficacy of sanctions, it's hardly something new. Carlson even talks about this minutes later, but why would these ones be especially bad? I don't even think this section of the video is particularly about advancing a pro-Russia agenda, as it becomes clear that Tucker Carlson has an agenda of his own, and this one is tied to the increasingly uncertain state of the American economy, because it turns out he believes there is an alternative to the American dollar that people can invest in.
That was the single most unwise thing any administration has done in my lifetime, 56 years, That was the dumbest thing. That was the most self-destructive thing. So what was gold trading at? Do you remember? If you got a phone in your hand right now, look it up. What was gold trading at? Just say February 1st.
Have I mentioned that Tucker Carlson is selling gold now? In fact, we got an ad for it a few minutes before that clip I just played.
When paper money dies, it's going to be replaced by programmable digital currency or gold. Gold survives.
Sometimes the grift is painfully obvious, and you better believe we'll be hearing more about the importance of buying gold as we move along in the month. Once it gets past the shameless fawning over Putin and his regime, we get to the interview with Karaganov. The interview is largely gentle as he lets Karaganov, a longtime supporter of invading Ukraine, say all sorts of wild things without any real pushback, including lots of suggestions that Russia will need to nuke Europe.
Now we would have to start to attack Europe with conventional weapons, and then next step will be waves of nuclear.
He even offers a time frame for this.
2 years. Now, if they do, well, 1 year.
Carlson acts like this is major news and is surprised it doesn't get more media coverage, but that's probably because Karaganov has been saying this since 2023. While this doesn't mean it should just be shrugged off, this guy is apparently someone Putin listens to, I think it's understandable that it doesn't get the same level of media attention when it's not exactly news anymore. That Carlson presents this as logical, as if Russia should have a genocidal veto over the affairs of other countries, make it sound like he's not just happy with Putin as Russia's dictator, but someone who should be the world's dictator. Though if you call Putin a dictator, he gets weirdly philosophical about it.
But does he have absolute control over Russia? Does any leader of any country ever have absolute control over the country? Did Stalin? No. He consulted with the constituencies in his country. They all do. Every one of them. Our president, every emir in the Gulf.
Vladimir Putin has been the de facto president of Russia for 26 years. There was a brief 4-year period where he had a puppet president while he was the prime minister, but then they eventually changed the constitution to remove term limits, and he has been sitting as the president ever since. His elections are obviously fraudulent, as political opposition are regularly jailed or, in some cases, assassinated. But Tucker Carlson would rather have some weird semantic argument to hide this clear fact about Putin being Russia's dictator. If you've heard Carlson's spiel about Russia, this video probably didn't surprise you much. It's a collection of greatest hits because I guess nothing interesting was going on in the news in the middle of January of 2026. Or maybe more accurately, Carlson just needed a bit more time to let his thoughts cook on some issues so he could present it to his audience in a way that was not entirely embarrassing for him. The next video featured a brief interview with Eva Villa-Dingebroek, who was refused entry into the UK. According to her, it was because she criticized Keir Starmer, but a more likely reason is her years of far-right anti-immigration advocacy. This one is pretty boring and features some generic anti-immigration talking points and pushes the Great Replacement conspiracy theory pretty hard. For those unfamiliar, the Great Replacement is the idea that countries with majorities considered white, particularly in Europe, are slowly being replaced by immigrants as a deliberate effort by a nefarious group of elites. Just who is this group?
Who's behind it? Honestly, I don't know. I can't answer that question.
It's a shame she doesn't have any guesses, but it doesn't take much scrolling to find the comments making a few suggestions. And as you might have guessed, it gets pretty anti-Semitic. The only other notable thing about this interview is that, even though it only runs for 30 minutes, Tucker manages to cram in 3 different ad reads. Very impressive stuff. The next interview is with Peter Brimlow, and it picks up the baton from the previous one and dives more deeply into the Great Replacement conspiracy theory. Brimlow is a longtime anti-immigration writer who I first heard about through the VDare website, which he founded. A website which he insists is not white nationalist, but does happen to feature pieces by several white nationalists. The SPLC has described VDare's content as hateful, and it's not very difficult to find all sorts of odious comments from its articles published throughout the years. But we don't have to go digging to find out what Brimlow is all about. Tucker Carlson reads a tweet about white solidarity to open this interview as he and Brimlow co-sign it.
If white men become a minority, we will be slaughtered. Remember, if non-whites openly hate white men while white men hold a collective majority, then they will be 1,000 times more hostile and cruel when they're a majority over whites. White solidarity is the only way to survive.
This anxiety fuels the idea that white people must hold power, lest the non-white people take power and enact some kind of ethnic-based retribution. It's a very clear argument for white supremacy, the basic idea that white people should hold supreme power in society. The purpose of an interview like this is to try to create solidarity among people through the lens of a white identity. The main problem with this is that white isn't really a meaningful identity, aside from it signifying who in certain societies have the majority of power. Whiteness as a concept in the United States has gradually expanded to include a number of groups that had previously not been considered white, such as the Irish or Italians. And some groups have historically drifted back and forth. The term Hispanic has historically been used to describe white people, but also non-white people. And I don't just mean people of Spanish descent, I mean anyone who speaks Spanish who may come from Latin America. As an example of the weakness of the term white culture, we saw this in action during a recent hearing in which several senators questioned a man named Jeremy Carl, who was chosen for a role in the State Department. He demonstrates quite clearly how it's difficult to define the term white culture. Also, as a quick warning, the audio gets a little crunchy here because Carl doesn't know how to speak into a microphone.
Certain types of Anglo-derived culture that comes from our history.
Like what?
Let me think about this. I would say that the white church is very different than the black church in terms of its tone and style on average. Foodways could often be different.
And those
music could be different.
And those are being erased.
Music could be different. Well, if you look at the Super Bowl halftime show, which was not in English this year.
What is a white church and what is white food? You can't really say what that is without describing specific religious affiliations or ethnic identities. This is pretty much true for anything that's described as white. You soon realize the idea of whiteness doesn't really mean much on its own. Rather, it's a shifting assembly of different people who happen to be grouped into a majority who hold power. For instance, if we're talking about white food, we could be talking about Italian food. But a century ago, Italians wouldn't be considered white. And I think it's ridiculous to assume that an influx of immigrants mean people will stop eating Italian food. In case people haven't noticed, it's delicious and people will probably be eating it for a long time to come. Tucker Carlson often decries the idea of identity politics, but he also is aware of the irony of him engaging in it. And he has this mocking reluctance when he talks about it.
Speak for myself, I'd rather live in a deracialized world where people think about it less because it does cause problems. But as long as you're encouraging identity politics, why do whites not get to have it?
Solidarity movements that blend a lot of different ethnic groups together are typically formed in opposition to oppression. As a recent example, we had the Stop Asian Hate movement, which was in reaction to an increased anti-Asian sentiment during the COVID-19 pandemic.
That name gets further and further away from China as opposed to calling it the Chinese virus. I can name Kung Flu.
People who blamed China for the virus decided to take out that frustration on Asian people generally. While Stop Asian Hate is obviously a solidarity movement to support Asian people, it isn't meant to imply that there is some kind of unifying Asian culture. Different people from across Asia will happily explain the differences in their respective cultures. The anger towards China is flattened to Asian people more broadly because the people expressing the anger can't be bothered to differentiate between someone who's Chinese and someone who's Thai or a member of some other Asian group. So in this case, a broad solidarity movement makes sense. If you look at the types of people who most typically have power in the US or Canada or Europe, it tends to be a lot of white people. So it's very hard to pretend you're being oppressed on the basis of your white identity without inventing these conspiracies of shadowy actors who are trying to attack white people. The Great Replacement as a theory could only exist with a group of secretive people plotting all of it.
At that point, the neo-conservatives, who were predominantly Jewish faction, they had this sort of Ellis Island view of America.
It shouldn't be surprising that it always seems to come back to this when it comes to these conspiracy theories. They tend to be more careful about the anti-Semitism, often using dog whistles and other weighty terms, so it isn't as clear as obvious as the racism. And here's something Tucker Carlson says in this interview.
White and non-white benefit alike from systems created by whites because they're more humane, they're more just, they're more fair, and they're much more efficient and cleaner, obviously.
Carlson doesn't get much more specific than this, and it's a wonderful example of a selective reading of history. If whiteness is getting credit for how great everything supposedly is, what about all the horrors as well? The genocide of the native peoples in the Americas, slavery, and imperial domination around the world. Historically, people who have lived in empires tend to have it pretty good when they're living close to the center of power. But when you look at the people who live on the outside or the fringes of that empire, their lives are not nearly as cushy or fun. When you look at the effects of colonialism that has elevated Europe to its present-day standing, it came at great cost to people in the Americas and Africa and Asia. This is never really discussed or even considered in this commentary because this is not an honest reckoning of history. It's simply creating an imaginary past to build a white solidarity movement in the present. This interview is one of the clearest examples of white nationalism being sanitized by Tucker Carlson, tying fears of immigration explicitly to threats against white people. Here is Brimlow trumpeting his own success.
If you speak to grassroots Republicans, as opposed to elected Republicans, the consensus is overwhelming that immigration's got to be ended. The consensus is overwhelming.
Tucker Carlson didn't stumble into this interview, and his previous one connects very cleanly to it. It won't be the last time it comes up this month either. It's part of a constant drumbeat to keep his audience locked into this fear of persecution from ethnic minorities. White nationalism is obviously a big part of his ongoing project, and whenever he acts like he isn't racist in any way, and he's confused that anyone could call him a white nationalist, that is a lie no one should fall for. The very next episode, titled Tucker on What the Violent ICE Protests Are Really About and What It Means for White America, continues this narrative. There's a lot that happens in this video, and if you want to dive into it in great detail, there's a recent podcast episode of Knowledge Fight that covered this very episode. There will be some overlap with a few of the things I'll be talking about, but if you finish this video and feel like you need to learn more, you have some homework ahead of you. Although the title suggests this video will be about Minnesota, the first half is mostly about building out and affirming the Great Replacement conspiracy theory, including some stuff that is so unserious it can only highlight how full of crap Tucker Carlson is.
Believing that the population of this or any other country is being manipulated by people in power, and the people who are born here are being replaced by people who weren't, believing that is not only wrong, it's misinformation, it's been debunked, it's also dangerous. You can kill people by believing that. Well, how does that work exactly?
The link between believing something and it leading to a behavior isn't a mystery, and it's not difficult to connect the Great Replacement theory specifically to violence. The 2019 Christchurch shooter, who killed 51 people, literally titled his manifesto The Great Replacement, and the 2022 Buffalo shooter, who killed 10 people, talked about it in his manifesto as well. Tucker Carlson should be keenly aware of that last example because he changed his tune after the shooting in Buffalo, choosing to avoid the term The Great Replacement.
The Great Replacement is not only real, it's the realest thing there is, and it's provably true.
Here's another lie Tucker Carlson tells.
And I think everyone would agree, whether they're right or wrong, that this is a period remembered as the best time in America, 1950.
For who? Certainly not Black Americans who lived under segregation. Certainly not women who were pressured into the fantasy of the nuclear housewife. Certainly not for anyone who wasn't a white man. I suppose that is the group Tucker Carlson really cares about here, so maybe he was telling the truth. This is how Tucker Carlson's monologues more or less roll along. He vaguely points to historical precedent, only lightly touching on examples, sometimes not even bothering to choose ones that make sense. Here's one quick example of replacement that he offers.
The colonial power moved non-indigenous people in order to make the case, this is ours now. And you see that everywhere. When the street across from the White House gets repainted in Black Lives Matter colors, it's kind of a species of that.
Black people have lived in the United States for centuries. How are they not American? Then being visible in government is only a replacement if you believe they need to be held perpetually as an underclass. And then he mentions Pride Week.
It was a matter of cultural imperialism. We run this now. Down with your monuments, up with ours. It's Pride Week.
Are there no gay white people? I suppose he means white culture simply doesn't include space for LGBT plus people. This is a sloppy mess. When I compare this to the monologues he had on Fox News, they were so much shorter and didn't ramble so wildly. He would make his point quickly, dress it up in some fancy language, and then move on from it. In his podcast, he's just sprawling all over the place, and he comes up with ridiculous lines.
And it's especially distressing when you look at the attitude of people in the United States who are pushing for mass demographic change. And just to put a tighter focus on it, people who are pushing for an end to the white majority. Oh, it's white supremacist to say that. No, it's not. It's an acknowledgement of reality.
Wanting to preserve a white majority, specifically in the context of political power, which he talks about throughout this video, is the definition of white supremacy. There's no attempt to present the plausible deniability here of white people incidentally holding all the power because they happen to be elected. Tucker Carlson wants white people to run the country. This is white supremacy. When he finally gets to what was happening in Minnesota at the time, about 39 minutes into the video, he doesn't really talk about the murder of Renee Good. He also doesn't mention Alex Preddy either, though in his defense, that particular killing hadn't happened yet. Instead, he wants to talk about what's really upsetting him, that a group of protesters interrupted a church service.
Running into a church and threatening the parishioners in the church.
It wasn't until much later in the video that Carlson mentions that one of the church's pastors works as a field director for ICE, which is why they were being protested. But before we can even get into that, because we still technically aren't getting into Minnesota, he goes on a diatribe about Russia and Ukraine for some reason, and how the West wanted to destroy Ukraine because it was white and Christian.
You think the land in Ukraine will be owned by Ukrainians in 20 years? No, of course not. It won't be Russia that did that. It'll be the West. And you have to wonder why. Well, the fact that Ukraine was white and Christian, one of the last big concentrations of white Christians on the planet, maybe that had something to do with it. Of course it did.
Carlson aggressively weaves all of this together, not in a way that actually makes sense, but it does create the vibe of a coherent worldview. There is no evidence to suggest the West, whatever he means by that, forced Russia to invade Ukraine. Putin's aggression is instead manipulated into this weird anti-white and anti-Christian conspiracy theory Carlson is pushing here. And you can see how these videos are all connected into one larger project, one that is trying to advance a white Christian nationalism. Carlson then interviews Nick Sortor and a former member of this church. It's all very silly, though I have to note for the first time ever, Nick Sortor seems to be reporting an actual news event instead of simply inserting himself into a story and crying about how he's a victim.
A group of friends of Don Lemon's breaking into a law enforcement vehicle and stealing the weapons out of the back.
They're not worried at all about any repercussions from Minneapolis PD.
The people who broke into these vehicles were arrested in the days that followed. Presenting this as an example of lawlessness is simply not true. It's also notable that this is being presented as the story when it was the same night in which a Venezuelan man was shot in the leg. As much as you might love some cars, I don't think they matter as much as a person being shot by ICE agents. And for good measure, we eventually get some lies about Renee Good, and repeating the claim that all of this is supposedly about fraud.
When this shooting happened, after the woman tried to run down an ICE agent with her vehicle, I was already out there because we were talking about the Somali fraud.
By the way, and this was a point made by a Minnesota official, if the federal government really wanted to stop fraud, they wouldn't be sending men with guns, they would be sending forensic accountants. Carlson and Sortor spend much of this video encouraging more force to be exercised against the people of Minnesota. Carlson in particular wants the military to be sent in. Keep in mind, these are American citizens, the white ones Carlson said he's so concerned about, and he's demanding military force be used against them.
They're stealing automatic weapons from federal agents and no one's doing anything about it. Like, where are the people we pay $1.5 billion a year to maintain this empire? Where are they when we need them here? Trillion.
Yeah, I think you meant 1.5 trillion, Tucker.
Trillion. Sorry, I'm.
Sortor gives something away at the end here.
Mayor Frey and Tim Walz don't want to lose a huge portion of their voter base when a bunch of Somali fraudsters end up being denaturalized and deported.
It's possible here that Sortor isn't bright enough to know what the term denaturalize means, but on the chance he does, what he's talking about here isn't deporting people who are undocumented. To denaturalize someone means you're taking away their citizenship. These are people who have legal status in the United States, and he wants them deported. It's very clearly not about following the immigration process, but rather removing legal immigrants. And the targeting of Somali and Latin American communities, I think, reveals that it's specifically about getting rid of non-white immigrants. This video is open white nationalism, and as I've shown from the earlier videos, it's very much part of a pattern. And I'm not even halfway through the month. The next video is a mere 30 minutes and is really just an extended ad to promote a movie Tucker Carlson is charging money for on his website called Replacing Europe. It's about, as you might have suspected, how Africans are replacing white people in Europe. This movie was actually put together by some young guys who went over to Europe and filmed a bunch of stuff. Since I am not giving Tucker Carlson a single cent of my money, I have no way of watching this movie. And since this conversation is just a tease for that movie with nothing really meaningfully discussed, I'm going to be skipping it over. The next video is another long-form ad, this time in the form of a conversation with Peter Schiff, and the title really has the main takeaway. Peter Schiff on gold's dominance over the S&P and the plot to stop you from noticing. The interview opens with Tucker Carlson asking about gold.
Peter Schiff, thank you for doing this. So when did you personally first start buying gold, physical gold?
After that, we got a long, droning conversation that drifts along various financial topics. The reason we got the gold mention up front, I suspect, is the same reason Tucker Carlson front-loads his videos with multiple ads in the first 30 minutes. For long videos, viewers often drop off the further they get through them, so crucial information is usually put right at the top, along with any ads to catch as many people as possible. They don't really return to the topic of gold until a little over halfway through the interview, and then they park the conversation there, including saying some wacky stuff.
I would imagine that if there's life on other planets, they value gold there too.
The back half of the video is where the more dedicated viewers are watching. This is where you start to get the real sell, and obviously what's being sold here is gold.
Like, so if you were giving advice to someone you loved, like, I've got $100, what do I do with it? I think the loving advice would be put some of it in gold.
Well, everybody should have some money in gold.
In late 2025, Tucker Carlson co-founded a new precious metals business called Battalion Metals, where they, of course, sell gold, along with a few other precious metals. It's impossible not to see this interview and its pro-gold commentary as a lengthy ad for that same business. And wouldn't you know it, his guest is also selling gold. His website is called Schiff Gold. So this supposed interview about the state of the US economy and how gold is a safer investment than other places you can put your money is coming from two guys who sell gold. I don't have the resources to tell you whether or not their services are worthwhile, but I have the experience of running a YouTube channel to know an ad when I see one, and this video is a 90-minute advertisement, using the state of the economy to capitalize on people's economic anxiety in order to sell them their product. The next video has the words "emergency response" in its thumbnail, and it's titled "Tucker Responds to the Death of Americans in ICE Protests." It came out 4 days after the killing of Alex Preddy and 21 days after the killing of Renee Good. When it comes to these news stories, the problem, as Carlson sees it, is chaos.
Of all the debates going on about immigration and who's in charge of this or that, the only real debate that matters right now is, will this chaos grow and get worse and consume us all, or will it not?
From there, he tries to offer some kind of analysis on what's going on the ground, and his criticism largely falls on the activists and the government officials in Minnesota, such as Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey, Governor Tim Walz, and Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan. He also frames protesters not as activists, but insurrectionists.
What you're watching is not a series of protests about immigration. What you're watching are the beginnings of a color revolution, of a kind of insurrection against federal authority.
His monologue is very messy, and when he finally gets to the subject of the two people killed in Minnesota, this is how he describes it. Pay special attention to how he handles the question on whether or not these killings can be justified.
2 Americans were killed by ICE officers, and we can debate whether or not that was justified. It was sad, and everybody should admit it was sad and bad. It's always sad when Americans die, period.
He blew right past whether or not these killings were justified, which seems like a central question, but he does think it's sad, which sounds like an admission, but doesn't really amount to anything.
Any normal person say, whoa, 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 let's cool this down. And by the way, to restate, to its great credit, the Trump administration has had that response and has gone to Tim Walz and said, whoa, let's cool this down. Tim Walz's response, no, because he's benefiting from it. That's why.
The obstruction by the federal government into the investigations of these deaths should be discussed, but Carlson would rather focus on how we can at least agree that the deaths are sad. And instead of looking at the federal government's role in any of this, he wants to instead shift blame to Tim Walz for not lowering the temperature. He doesn't say anything about how the administration lied about both of these deaths immediately after they happened, until it's brought up an hour later by his guest, Michael Schellenberger, who comes out with it during the interview. Of course, in this case, the blame is only placed on Kristi Noem instead of Stephen Miller or Donald Trump, who spread similar lies about Preddy and Good. And Carlson's objective of protecting federal agencies remains the same. This is a longer clip of what sounds like good stuff until we get Schellenberger's absurd turn at the end as Carlson nods along.
Secretary of Homeland Security, Kristi Noem, just got up there and trashed Alex Preddy clearly it was.
Unbelievable. I agree.
Yeah, it was just obviously what she was saying was false, and I I don't understand it. I mean, I found it dehumanizing and gross.
Yes,
I think
I agree.
Good and Preddy are victims of the left, and that should have been what they said.
Carlson's construction of this issue is to almost exclusively blame the left and Democratic politicians. Here's an example of how he twists comments from Peggy Flanagan.
Then show up and use your voice. Put your body on the line and use non-violent direct action, which is one of the most important tools in our toolbox.
Use your bodies. Put your bodies on the line. She is encouraging citizens in her state to risk their lives.
The point that Carlson ignores is that putting your body on the line should not be risking your life when you're using non-violent direct action. He's taking it as a given that any non-violent opposition to the government agencies will inevitably lead to people getting killed. If someone is resisting non-violently, in what way is a lethal response justified? Carlson's construction is more sinister in that it supposes that Flanagan is secretly hoping for more deaths, along with Walz and Frey, that this will somehow lead them to accruing more power. It's assuming the people of Minnesota are simply pawns moving at the behest of their elected officials. He's ironically granting them a power and influence far higher than they already have. I'd wager that when it comes to what's motivating the people of Minnesota, it's not comments from elected officials that's angering them, it's the videos of people being brutalized or killed by agents from ICE and other similar agencies. If any anger is expressed over these killings, he wants to make sure it's pointed against the officials speaking out against the surge in federal agents into the state.
The question is, why did it happen? And it happened because of people like Jacob Frey and Governor Walz and Lieutenant Governor Peggy.
You might be saying to yourself, hey, at least we're seeing Carlson stick to current events instead of turning this into another video about white Christians being under attack. And if you were hoping for a break from that kind of commentary, you're not going to have a very good time with this clip.
Two things our ruling classes object to the most strenuously, they don't always say it aloud, though often they do: Christianity, not religion, Christianity specifically, and white people.
From here, we get another round of Tucker Carlson complaining about white Christians being persecuted. The reason I feel like I need to bring this up each time he does it is because I want to get across this is in so many of his videos. Eventually, after much buildup and over 50 minutes, he gets to the part of the video where he has some criticism for the federal government, aside from calling out Kristi Noem a little bit earlier. And this criticism of the federal government is sorely lacking. First off, he wants to let everyone know that he is not attacking Donald Trump.
But it doesn't matter how much you love Trump, or voted for him, or if, like me, you campaigned in multiple states with Trump. It's not an attack on Trump to note that, you should not trust the government.
Then he goes on to question the loyalty of the military and how the government persecuted Donald Trump.
Is the uniformed U.S. military, are its leaders sort of on the side of the rule of law? We never have to think about that. When the government, his own federal agencies, tried to send Trump and his kids to prison for the rest of their lives with the Russiagate hoax?
This really encapsulates the kind of criticism he offers the federal government, incredibly sycophantic to Donald Trump while nibbling around the edges towards safer targets. Because it's quite clear that he's very much a cheerleader for everything ICE and other deportation groups are doing, because ultimately he wants to make the United States as white as possible. When it comes to what happens next, Carlson weighs three possibilities: arresting Democratic leadership for their supposed role in the protests. Another one is cutting off the entire state of Minnesota from federal support and effectively quarantining it. But it's the first option where he suggests sending in the troops that has a very troubling conclusion.
If you sent enough of them, you sent the 101st Airborne, like Eisenhower did at Central High School in Little Rock, 1956, maybe that would work. But you'd have to send a lot, and you'd have to take a pretty no-nonsense posture. And what are the chances people get killed? Very high. But you could try it. And then you would have to kind of deal with the aftermath, but maybe it would be worth it.
This more clearly describes what he thinks about people such as Renee Good, Alex Preddy, and Keith Porter, acceptable losses. He's certainly sad about it, or at least he says he is, but his tears, whether they're real or not, are no comfort to the people and their loved ones who have to pay the price for his white nationalist dream. The interview with Schellenberger is similarly detached from reality as it frequently describes protesters as a militia and guerrilla fighters.
There's a city that decides to have its own militia, its own private army.
I want to go back to the first video I covered here, though. This is Tucker Carlson's conversation with his brother Buckley. In it, Buckley tells a story where he is the victim of injustice when he's harassed by park police. And instead of meekly complying, he boldly stands up to them. Here's how Tucker Carlson describes it.
Now I think that if 8 more people in our neighborhood and 800,000 more people in our country had taken that attitude, we'd be in much better shape than we are now.
And what was that injustice? Well, I did mention it earlier in the video.
And you had a million dogs as always, and you never leashed them because you're a free man, and this is America.
Tucker finds something heroic in his brother standing up to park police for demanding he put a leash on his dog. But he sees no heroism in people standing up for their neighbors to not be snatched off the street on dubious grounds by masked agents of the government. I think it's a clear juxtaposition of the world he lives in, what he believes he and people like him are entitled to, and the world he sees others living in, and the sort of subjugation they should experience when they want to stand against an injustice. The next video was a nearly 2.5-hour interview with Cenk Uygur of the Young Turks that somehow felt even longer than its runtime. One of the first things Cenk says in this interview is that he's on this show to try and create unity because he believes the powers that be are trying to divide the right and the left.
I also want to break down the barriers of Republicans versus Democrats, right wing versus left wing. I think that it's kind of used to divide us.
As I've hopefully demonstrated in this video, one of Tucker Carlson's specialties is dividing people, particularly when it comes to upholding white supremacy. You might be surprised to hear that. Unlike most of the other podcast episodes I watched while putting together this video, this is one of the very few where Tucker Carlson doesn't mention how white Christians in America are under attack. Much of the first half of the interview features Uygur nearly monologuing while describing the many crimes committed by the Israeli government. And there's a lot to go through when it comes to recounting the crimes of a country committing a genocide. Although they're aligned on the subject, there's no real delving into how they might disagree about it and what motivates their opposition. As we'll see in a later video, I suspect they aren't being motivated by the same concerns. At another point in the interview, Uygur talks about how his show has ignored identity politics, and Carlson agrees with him.
But we're saying don't do identity politics.
Exactly.
Okay. Why? Because identity politics splits us apart.
Exactly.
If you've watched at least some of the earlier parts of this video, you've seen multiple examples of Tucker Carlson engaging in identity politics, specifically for white Christians. He might try to present it as self-defense, but he is nonetheless playing that game. And that claim of self-defense only makes sense when you look at his actions through the lens of a racist conspiracy theory like the Great Replacement. These contradictions aren't brought up by either man, and throughout this video it seems like there's this unspoken agreement between them to focus on topics they can happily agree on, rather than the ones they disagree on. This is what makes interviews like this one profoundly boring and uninteresting. I'm going to jump ahead 2 videos to another one Tucker Carlson released where he more openly expressed his concerns. This one is titled, "The Shocking Reality of the Treatment of Christians in the Holy Land by US-Funded Israel." The video features 2 interviews, one with Archbishop Hossam Noum and another with Saad Mushar. The purpose of these interviews is to shine a light on how Christians have been getting by in both Israel and Jordan. And unsurprisingly, there's a lot of criticism for Israel and very little for Jordan.
How are Christians in the Holy Land doing? Are they thriving or are they suffering?
This video, juxtaposed with the Cenk Uygur one, seems to feature a very different Tucker Carlson, one who seems far more interested in asking not about Israel's crimes against all Palestinians, but specifically about their crimes against Christians. Carlson frequently walks back to this idea of American support for Israel should be understood in the context of the United States being a Christian nation.
The United States, the most important Christian country in the world.
As we can see very clearly in his other videos, Carlson frequently speaks about Christians being persecuted, particularly in the United States, and he regularly frames his political opponents as anti-Christian. To Carlson, the US has a Christian majority that must be preserved because he believes it should be a nation that champions Christian values. In other words, he's a Christian nationalist. This is what I find so consistently troubling about Tucker Carlson's commentary, even when he is ostensibly on the right side of an issue. The genocide being committed by Israel deserves to be called out. But how and why it's being called out matters too. Carlson seems perfectly happy to humanize and empathize with people abroad, albeit primarily through the lens of Christianity, but he can't extend that same level of humanity to people who share his country. And when he argues for the humanity of people abroad, he always reminds people of his conception of the United States as a Christian nation. He's not someone who sees religious or ethnic nationalism as a problem, so long as it's his religion or his ethnicity that's in charge. This is what makes him a bad ally to have, even when he stands on the right side of an issue. His solutions are not one that would lead to the sort of world I would want to live in. Going back to the interview with Cenk Uygur, Tucker Carlson deliberately not bringing up his concerns over white people and Christians seems more like a deliberate choice, one that allows him to talk to someone claiming to represent the left, seemingly as an ally, downplaying the parts of his ideology that would probably lead to friction in that conversation. That's why I think it's so important to really examine the output he does in its totality and look at his criticisms in their context. Having an ally like Tucker Carlson seems like far more trouble than it's worth when someone can easily bring up the fact that he is clearly and obviously a white Christian nationalist. Part of Uygur's comments in his interview with him try to frame Carlson and himself as working together to fight the establishment voices as outsiders. This is another problem I have because I can't imagine how anyone can see Tucker Carlson as someone on the outside of the establishment, especially with what happens later in the interview. Tucker Carlson happened to be caught on camera during a meeting Donald Trump had with oil executives about carving up Venezuela's oil interests. According to Tucker Carlson, this was all an accident.
I was having lunch with Trump and he's like, oh, come to the oil meeting. And like, I don't, it's not my world. So I was like, okay. So I go up there and all these heads of the big oil companies, including Exxon, they didn't seem too enthusiastic about it, but we'll see. And I just happened to be sitting in the room totally by accident. I mean, literally by accident because he's asked me to come.
That's a line I genuinely have no read on whether or not it's true. I absolutely would believe it was a lie under a normal administration, as a meeting like this would be tightly controlled. But Donald Trump seems so lost that I could see him bringing Tucker Carlson into a meeting and no one having the guts to say no. Whether it's true or not, it should be understood as a signal at just how deeply connected he is with the administration. However people try to spin it otherwise, there's a reason he and the president are having lunch together. And it's not because Donald Trump likes having his decisions being aggressively challenged. Going back to the video shot in Jerusalem, we can see more of Carlson's reluctance to criticize more challenging targets. In these interviews, Carlson frequently brings up Mike Huckabee.
But our ambassador's very involved in internal matters in Israel, of course. Have you spoken to Ambassador Huckabee? Did Ambassador Huckabee say anything about this? I just want to be very clear about his shameful anti-Christian behavior. I just want to be very clear about what I'm saying. What Ambassador Huckabee is doing is shameful. So Huckabee hasn't helped you get to your Christian hospital in Gaza.
I don't want to blame Huckabee for this.
It's genuinely funny how often he keeps getting called out. As the ambassador to Israel, it makes some sense, but the ambassador doesn't really set the policy agenda. Carlson should really be calling out Donald Trump or someone higher up in the government, but he seems very hesitant to do that. Maybe he can bring it up the next time they grab lunch together. A major news story that Tucker Carlson didn't really touch on throughout the month I watched him is the release of the Epstein files. Millions of documents, many of them connecting people Carlson knows to the human trafficker and pedophile Jeffrey Epstein. Eventually, he found a guest and an angle that let him cover the subject safely. For this, he decided to speak to Ian Carroll, a guy I only recently learned of when he was filling in for Candace Owens while she was on maternity leave. That should give you a pretty good idea of where he stands in the whole conspiracy theory world. Instead of digging into the many new details that have been sussed out in the files implicating so many political figures, Tucker Carlson instead wants us to go back and relitigate one of the more embarrassing conspiracy theory duds, Pizzagate.
So we thought it would be interesting just to start with a very narrow slice of the material, and that's the emails and texts that we can be pretty sure were sent from or to Jeffrey Epstein that pertain to the question of food, specifically pizza.
We're going to be shown what is, apparently, explosive new evidence that will change everyone's mind about Pizzagate. And here it is.
And here's the line that inspired the segment you're about to watch. After you use them, after you use the erectile dysfunction drugs, after you take Viagra or its equivalent, we're quoting, wash your hands and let's go get pizza and grape soda. Call me.
For some fuller context, apparently in the original jump of John Podesta's emails that started this whole Pizzagate thing, there was a reference to Jeffrey Epstein eating some pizza and grape soda.
And I know, as an actual pizza fan, that pizza is very unhealthy. I mean, it's been a lifelong struggle for me. Pizza and grape soda? Like, these are the last things that people who care about their health eat.
The fact that Epstein enjoys this childlike meal is being presented as some kind of bombshell, and that we must now reconsider all the vague, largely meaningless evidence from those early emails about people getting pizza. What this whole segment misses is that in many of the recently released emails from the Epstein files, we can see that Epstein and his friends were perfectly capable of discussing their sex crimes without using some ridiculous coded language. What should be taken even more seriously is that part of the reason we even know to look for these allegations is that many victims have come forward with details on how they were abused and trafficked, and none of them have mentioned anything about this particular pizza parlor. Instead of going over all the very real evidence, Carol and Carlson go over the claims against Comet Ping Pong, the pizzeria supposedly organizing satanic child abuse ceremonies. They bring up all the old tired points, such as weird artwork being in the wall and strange comments being left under their Instagram posts. But they never once produce any new evidence, aside from that one text Epstein got from his urologist about getting pizza and grape soda. It's a phenomenal waste of time. There was one funny part in this interview, though, when Tucker Carlson reveals he used to go to that pizza place with his kids.
Comet Pizza in Washington, which, by the way, was like very close to my house where I brought my children there because it was the pizza place in my neighborhood, which the whole thing is so weird.
Carlson didn't just go there once or twice. He literally knew the guy who owned the place.
I took my kids to brunch at Comet Pizza. I know the guys who own it. Like, there's no way this can be real, right? I mean, I'll just admit it. I felt that way. I was wrong, obviously.
You would think Ian Carroll, who fancies himself someone who asks tough questions, would have a few of them for Tucker Carlson in that moment, but he doesn't bother. I guess he thinks it's more important to be polite to your host rather than question their connection to a supposed pedophile ring. Eventually, about 40 minutes into this interview, they get around to other findings in the Epstein files, and they name people who should be questioned. Curiously, the name of Donald Trump doesn't get nearly as much attention as Bill Gates or Howard Lutnick. And just for the record, everyone in those files should be questioned. I think it's just very funny that these two are so clearly afraid of directly implicating a man like Donald Trump, who is named extensively throughout them. This is the closest Carroll gets to mentioning Trump.
There's a bunch of people in Trump's circle and around him that are very much implicated in these files.
And Carlson doesn't even get that close, instead alluding to some kind of partisan trap Trump is afraid of walking into.
Trump is obviously sensitive to like partisan traps after the Russian nonsense.
This video is a highlight reel of moral cowardice. Donald Trump, who pushed so hard to keep these files from getting released, and who desperately wants to get them out of the media cycle, has his name all over them. Instead of confronting that head-on, these two instead want to dredge up Pizzagate. It's a ridiculous joke that reveals how craven they are. Next, Tucker interviews billionaire Ray Dalio about a supposed coming civil war and, of course, the importance of buying gold.
So I asked you, is it crazy to, take some money and buy some gold? And you said it's not crazy at all.
To be perfectly honest, I found this whole interview to be incredibly boring. Dalio seems to think he's created a deep understanding of how societies rise and fall, and it's not very convincing or interesting. I was curious to learn more about Dalio, though, and I wanted to know where this supposed authority came from and found a book written about his investment firm that was published in 2023. Although Dalio promotes this supposedly advanced investment strategy, the book contends that money made by his top-performing hedge fund comes from legally obtained insider information from government officials from countries around the world. Apparently, this is something you can legally do. I'm honestly not sure how this guy ended up speaking to Tucker Carlson in this interview, and it certainly isn't their first time talking, but this whole thing just seems like a very wealthy man trying to market himself and his hedge fund. And with that video, my month watching Tucker Carlson came to an end. That last one was a bit of a whimper, unfortunately, but, well, not every video can be a winner. At least that one didn't devolve into open white Christian nationalism like so many of his other videos. The overarching theme of these videos is very clearly white supremacy. It was, by far, the most common topic discussed. If you mix that in with the Christian nationalism, I think you get a very clear idea of what Tucker's project with all of this seems to be. Even in the videos where he doesn't explicitly make his claim to white nationalism, he still has to bring up this endless crying about being called racist. It all reads as desperately insecure, probably because it's painfully obvious that this idea of white supremacy is so clearly motivating what Carlson is doing here. And he desperately needs his audience to not label him racist. Another common thing I noticed in these videos is how often Tucker Carlson claims not to know things. One of his favorite techniques is to describe his ignorance on accusations against him and subjects he's covering. It's pretty effective if you take him at face value. though I wonder how someone like him could survive in media for so long and still somehow know so little about it. He seems to have a wide-eyed wonder about anything he's trying to present as innocent or not as harmful as people often discuss it, whether it's his own racism or the dangers of Vladimir Putin. He seems shocked at all the negativity expressed towards those things. If you're wondering whether I think Tucker Carlson is being honest with all of this, I don't think he's quite as simple-minded as someone like Dave Rubin or Tim Pool, although sometimes I do wonder if we give him more credit for his cunning than he actually deserves. Ultimately, it doesn't matter. He's still spreading a huge amount of hateful propaganda, and what actually exists inside his mind is not nearly as important as the stuff he puts out into the world. Another big theme I noticed in this month of videos is the subject of gold. I didn't clock every time it was mentioned, but it came up with the frequency you'd expect from someone who has a business selling it. The front loading of ads and obnoxious shilling really reminds you that Tucker Carlson is here to make some money. Reflecting on this month of Tucker Carlson, when I look back to what he was saying on Fox News to what he's saying today, it's more or less the same message, but with far less polish and a much lower production budget. I remember people falling for his song and dance when he got that Fox News show the first time, and I only hope people don't fall for that same song and dance in 2026. Just because he can identify a problem with corruption amongst elites that are in power doesn't mean that he's operating in the same direction you are, unless you happen to be a white Christian nationalist. Because if you are a white Christian nationalist, he is unquestionably your guy. If anyone pays close attention to the dates for these various videos, you might notice that there was one that is curiously absent, and that was the very last one at the tail end of my scheduled time for watching a month of Tucker Carlson stuff. It was a long interview with Ron Paul, and the reason I didn't include it is, honestly, I felt a little uncomfortable watching it. Ron Paul is 90 years old, and while he doesn't seem as impaired as Donald Trump or Joe Biden, his answers often rambled and drifted around, particularly in the second half of that interview. And while I've never been a Ron Paul fan in any way, it felt a little weird covering a guy who clearly has lost a couple of steps and honestly isn't nearly as relevant as he once was when he dominated YouTube comment sections. Speaking of YouTube comment sections, you might want to head there right now if you want to support this channel in a non-monetary fashion. You can also like, subscribe, and hit the bell for notifications. If you've got a couple of extra bucks, consider becoming a patron or a channel member, like the fine names you see scrolling up the screen now. They get early access to videos and other fun bonuses I throw in along the way. You can also support me on Nebula by following the subscription link below. Thank you all so much for watching.